All right, well, welcome everybody. Hope everybody got a chance to take some lunch. It's my true pleasure to introduce Professor John Knox, the Henry C. Lauerman Professor of International Law at Wake Forest University School of Law. Professor Knox is a well-known international expert on human rights law and international environmental law. And in that capacity, he was appointed to be the first United Nations Special Rapporteur on human rights. In that capacity, it was an appointment that was described as a historical mandate. He produced two important reports on children's rights and the environment, as well as framework principle on human rights and the environment. Today, he will be speaking to us about the interrelationship of human rights and the environment, including climate change, under environmental law, and we're really delighted to have you.
Okay, thank you very much. It's nice to be here. So, as you heard, my name is John Knox, and I'm a professor at Wake Forest University. But for the last 6 years or so, until last summer, I was the first United Nations Special Rapporteur on human rights and the environment. So I'm going to talk first today about human rights and the environment and their relationship, and then I'll talk about human rights and climate change in particular. So let's kind of start with some basics about human rights. If you've taken a human rights law course, you already know this, but let's just start from scratch anyway. The kind of the modern document that's the seminal point for human rights law generally is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1948. Here it is being held by Eleanor Roosevelt, who is the chair of the Human Rights Commission, which drafted the document and presented it to the United Nations General Assembly. The UN, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights includes a lot of rights that seem familiar, at least to American law students, such as rights to life, liberty, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, but it also includes rights called economic, social, and cultural rights that are not familiar in the US tradition, but are familiar other places. That includes rights to Social Security, equal pay for equal work, an adequate standard of living, the highest attainable standard of health. What it does not include is anything like a human right to a healthy environment. You can look at the Universal Declaration as a word cloud. There's no environment reference in there. You can look for a while. I have, but it's not in there. So why is that? Is it because Eleanor Roosevelt just forgot? She spent all this time drafting the Universal Declaration, it just didn't really cross her mind? No, we can defend her from that charge. It's because the modern environmental movement, the thing that kind of reawoken people's interest in environmental protection, really didn't kick off until the late 1960s. The first Earth Day was April 1970. The major environmental legislation in the United States was largely enacted in the early 1970s. The first massive international meeting, the conference on environmental issues was in Stockholm in 1972. And by that time, not only had the Universal Declaration been adopted, but so had treaties based on it. So the two fundamental human rights treaties, the International Covenants on Civil and Political Rights and on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, were both adopted by the General Assembly in 1966. So what that meant was there really was no human right to a healthy environment. Nevertheless, that didn't stop human rights advocates and environmental advocates, such as here, Kumi Naidoo, who at the time this picture was taken was the executive director of Greenpeace. They brought environmental claims, but they dressed them up in human rights clothes. They began to argue that environmental harm violated certain human rights. They couldn't really argue it based on the human right to a healthy environment, which didn't exist at the international level. So instead they argued that environmental harm violated rights to life and health and food and water and culture and lots of other specific human rights. This quote from Naidoo says, "Let's break down the artificial barriers that have so long separated the human rights, environmental, and development communities. We face common threats, but there are common solutions." Naidoo, does anyone know what his job is now? He's now the executive director of Amnesty International. So he did exactly what he was encouraging people to do, which is move from an environmental to a human rights body. Where did they bring these claims? They brought them to places like regional human rights tribunals. This is a picture of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in San Jose, Costa Rica, which has jurisdiction over Latin American and Caribbean human rights claims. It began to hear claims in specific, many of which involved violations of the rights of indigenous peoples in Latin America. They brought claims to UN treaty bodies, that is, bodies that oversee compliance with the major human rights treaties. This is a picture of the Human Rights Committee, which oversees compliance with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And they brought claims to so-called special rapporteurs. Special rapporteurs are appointed by the United Nations Human Rights Council, which is the successor to the old Human Rights Commission that Eleanor Roosevelt chaired back in the 40s. The Human Rights Council, like a lot of intergovernmental bodies, is composed of 47 governments. It's the principal United Nations human rights body. But like many intergovernmental bodies, it's very reluctant to do very much on human rights. It's really reluctant to criticize. Governments are very reluctant to criticize each other for violating human rights. But one thing it does do is appoint special rapporteurs. It can appoint special rapporteurs on country levels. So for a specific country like Iran or Myanmar, there's a special rapporteur that issues reports on the human rights situation in that country. And it can also appoint so-called thematic special rapporteurs that look at the situation involving a particular right. For example, there's a special rapporteur on freedom of expression, or a particular threat. There's a special rapporteur on torture. So these special rapporteurs also began to address environmental issues as they affected issues within their scope. So this, for example, where's my little, so this gentleman is Olivier de Schutter, a law professor in Belgium. He was the former special rapporteur on the right to food. This is Jim Anaya, the special rapporteur on indigenous rights. He was now the dean of the University of Colorado Law School. But before that, he was a special rapporteur that focused on the effects of environmental harm, among other things, on indigenous peoples. So as a result, there began to be this greening of human rights law. These bodies issued decisions and statements and reports explaining how human rights could be interfered with by environmental harm. So the United Nations, most of this activity had not really taken place at the United Nations intergovernmental level. But in 2012, the United Nations decided to create a new mandate on human rights and the environment and appoint someone, who later turned out to be me, to address the issue, essentially to study how environmental harm and human rights protection interacted with each other. This is a picture of the room in Geneva in the Palais des Nations where the Human Rights Council meets. This is not a mistake of the picture. That's actually what the ceiling looks like. It's a multicolored system of, what are the things that come down? Stalagmites, stalactites, whichever one hangs off the ceiling. It's tights, right? Because they hold tight to the ceiling. That's how you remember them, right? Anyway, so it really looks like this ceiling is about to fall in, or at least parts of it are. These pointy things look like they're kind of coming off the ceiling. It was composed at a cost of several $1 million by a Spanish artist. And I have to say, I used to make fun of it at first, but I've kind of come to really like it because I spent a lot of time in that room listening to diplomatic interventions, which can go on a long time and be somewhat mind-numbing. And so it's a way to pass the time. I would look at these different stalactites and kind of mentally draw a line from them straight down and try and figure out where they would hit if they landed and whether they might take out that French representative who was going on so long. So anyway, this was the Human Rights Council meeting room, and it decided to create a mandate on the human rights obligations relating to the enjoyment of a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Now, you'll notice that it appointed this person, who again turned out to be me, first as an independent expert. This is the name the council gives when the relationship that it's appointing a mandate to study has not been sufficiently well established yet. So for example, there was an independent expert on the right to water that later got turned into a special rapporteur on the right to water. First, they asked her, just as they asked me, to study this obligation. Tell us what exactly it entails so we know whether this is something that it makes sense to appoint a special rapporteur to study. The special rapporteurs, their job is more about promoting compliance and overseeing, calling out violations, overseeing implementation. So my first couple of years, I held a number of consultations around the world, and with the help of a lot of pro bono assistants, including lawyers and academics and law students, I issued a series of 14 reports. each of the reports addressed one source of human rights law and how it had addressed environmental issues. So I had a report on the Inter-American Court of Human Rights and a different report on the European Court of Human Rights and so forth. So as a result of all this, I presented a mapping report to the Human Rights Council, which basically summed up what human rights bodies had said about environmental issues. The report is much longer than 2 sentences, but if I had to sum up the summary report in 2 sentences, these would be the 2 sentences. Essentially, that human rights and the environment have an interdependent relationship. You really cannot enjoy a vast range of human rights, again, including rights to life, health, property, and many others, if you don't have a healthy environment. But at the same time, it's clear that you need to be able to exercise your human rights, such as your rights of freedom of expression, freedom of association, your rights to participate in government, your rights to seek effective remedies, in order to try and push forward, to try and ensure effective environmental protection. So the mandate was renewed in March 2015 for another 3 years, and it was added, the council added, 2 new requirements: that I promote and report on the realization of human rights obligations, and I work on identifying challenges and obstacles, which is kind of UN governmental speak for violations of rights. So the idea was here that the mandate was designed to look more like, it was renewed and designed to look more like other special rapporteurships. And in fact, the name of the mandate was changed so after that my title became Special Rapporteur, which I have to say does sound a lot cooler than independent expert, right? Although my daughters never really, they can't say it without laughing out loud. Nevertheless, so in 2018, I issued a bunch more reports between 2015 and 2018, and it all kind of culminated in this report on framework principles on human rights and the environment, which I'll just go through very briefly. The idea was that this just sums up all of the human rights obligations relating to the environment. Again, I made the point of interdependence between the two. And then I pointed out a number of procedural obligations. Again, these are obligations not just that I think are good ideas, although I do think they're good ideas, but these are obligations that human rights bodies had identified as being necessary for governments in order to protect human rights from environmental harm. So a number of procedural obligations: protecting environmental defenders, freedom of expression, peaceful assembly and association, education, public awareness, environmental information, assessing environmental impacts, public participation, access to effective remedies. These are all procedural obligations in the sense that they don't necessarily require a particular level of substantive protection. That is, you can go through all of this, deliberate about the right level of environmental protection, and then decide whatever level makes sense for your society. But they do ensure that your society is involved in the decision, that it's not simply a matter of the most powerful interests in your society telling everybody else this is what's going to happen. Human rights bodies also set some things about substantive standards, although they were much more deferential to governments and societies about that. That is, no one expects Ghana and Germany to have exactly the same level of air pollution control. Obviously, Germany can afford much more than countries like Ghana have. Nevertheless, at whatever level the government decides to choose, environmental standards should be non-discriminatory, they should be non-retrogressive, they should try not to go backwards, they should strike a reasonable balance, and occasionally human rights bodies will say that governments have not done those things. And then, of course, they should be enforced, whatever level they are. What about cross-border, transboundary, or even global environmental harm? Human rights law says there's a duty to cooperate to face global threats, and I said that obviously applies to problems like climate change. We'll come back to that in just a moment. And then finally, I included in the framework principles statements about the importance of protecting those who are most at risk, the ones who are most vulnerable. Obviously, non-discrimination is like this thread that runs throughout all of human rights law. It definitely applies in the environmental context. But governments need to do more than just not discriminate. They need to take steps to try and protect those who are most at risk from environmental harm. And then finally, governments sometimes like to say, well, as long as we're pursuing sustainable development, as long as we're doing things for the right reasons, we don't have to worry that much about human rights. And that's, of course, not true. Even if you're doing something that has environmental benefits, you still have to make sure you're not rolling over people's human rights along the way. If you want to build a new renewable energy source, that's a great thing, but not if it involves displacing people without paying them for their property or consulting them if they've lived there a long time. Governments sometimes like to try and cut corners, let's say. My very last report, I suggested that really it is time finally for the United Nations to recognize a human right to a healthy environment. Many states have already. In fact, the vast majority of states in the world have already done so. More than 100 states have done so in their national constitutions, and many more have entered into agreements, or I guess there's not many more than 100, but others have also entered into international agreements recognizing the international right to a healthy environment at the regional level. The real holdouts here are, as you might expect, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, essentially Anglo common law tradition countries, and then a few others that aren't too surprising either, like China, countries in Southeast Asia. But there's a lot of support for the idea that it's time for the United Nations to finally recognize a human right to a healthy environment and make up for Eleanor Roosevelt's oversight 60 years ago. I guess 70 years ago now. All right, so what about human rights and climate change? What's the point of a human rights perspective on climate change? I think there's essentially three benefits. First, it helps to clarify what's at stake. Human rights language is the closest thing we have in the world to a kind of agreed moral framework. We don't all agree with the same religious precepts. We certainly don't all have the same ethical traditions, but human rights law does provide a kind of moral language we can use to talk about issues that is as accepted as any language we have today. Second, human rights law is law. For many countries, it's enforceable at the national level or the regional level. I don't want to overstate that. The enforcement mechanisms are often ineffective. But human rights law does provide legal standards that you can use as benchmarks. And finally, and third, the courts and countries that do accept that human rights law is enforceable now can start to hear cases involving climate change. And I'll talk about that toward the end of the talk today. So let me say a few words more about each of these three benefits. So clarifying the moral stakes. This is a picture of Mary Robinson, the first female president of Ireland and later the High Commissioner for Human Rights. After she stopped being the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, she started a foundation, the Mary Robinson Foundation for Climate Justice. This is all about climate change and human rights. She has called, as you see here, she has called climate change the greatest threat to human rights in the 21st century. That may seem like an exaggeration when there's so many other great candidates for the greatest threat to human rights in the 21st century. But her point is that climate change makes everything else worse off. Without climate change, again, you simply can't enjoy your fundamental human rights apart from whatever else is going on in your country. So let's just kind of review some basics about climate change here. First, as you well know, the temperature is rising, even though it doesn't seem like it would be so today. It's gone up. We're about 1 degree Celsius above where we were the global average temperature before temperatures started to rise. About 1 degree Celsius, which, as you know, is 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a very significant increase. This chart kind of makes it look up and down, back and forth. The trend is clear, but this chart I like because it makes it even clearer. With this chart, this is from the New York Times a couple of years ago, what it did is control for El Nino, the climactic weather effect that essentially causes some years to be warmer than others. So if you just look at the years without El Nino, those are the orange dots here, you get an even clearer kind of straight line up. In other words, a lot of the noise here is caused by outlier years because of El Nino. Controlling for that, it's a pretty steady march toward warmer and warmer temperature. And as you know, that's because we keep pumping more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. This is a chart that goes back 800,000 years and shows that carbon dioxide and global average temperature goes more or less in tandem together. We are now above where this was in 2014. We're now about 406, 408, I think, so we're a little bit farther up. But you see what we're doing here. Some people, I think, take away from this chart that maybe there's not as much to worry about as we might think, because actually temperatures have gone up and down a lot in planetary history, and that's absolutely true. The planet has been a lot warmer than it is now, and of course a lot colder than it is now. So I think sometimes environmentalists, and I include myself in this category, sometimes we get a little sloppy with our language. We say the planet's at risk. You know, the planet's not really at risk. The planet will be fine. The planet, for all we know, is kind of looking forward to the day when we destroy ourselves and it gets rid of us. Who knows what the planet is really thinking? But the point is, humans are at risk. We have not been around for those hundreds of thousands of years. We have not lived through these previous, ice ages and greenhouse gas spikes. Our societies only go back, let's be generous, say it goes back about 12,000 years. That's as far as we have any kind of written records, pretty much everywhere in the world. What's really noticeable about that is how stable the climate has been over that period. There's a lot of information on this which you can just kind of ignore. The main thing to take away is here on the y-axis, the temperature anomaly over the last 12,000 years, this blue line, has really varied very little, only about 1/2 degree up and down. Going back before that, of course, it was much colder. We were in the last set of ice ages. Now we're leaving it. This is where we are about now, and this is where we'll be at 2 degrees of warming. So we're literally going to places that we have never, as any human society has ever seen before. What would that mean for us? I think one way to get a handle on what we're talking about here is to think about what the world looked like when we were in the last ice age. This is not that long ago, people. And during the last ice age, this would have been considered, let's put it this way, you wouldn't have seen any of this because ice would have been a mile thick over this part of Michigan. Ice was a mile thick over what's now Chicago, over New York. All that was just buried under gigantic sheets of ice. That's only 3 to 5 degrees colder Celsius than we are now. So imagine what 3 to 5 degrees warmer will look like. So what does a human rights perspective add? One simple thing it does is it just makes us think about people being affected rather than stranded polar bears. If you search for climate change images, it's remarkable how many pictures you'll get of stranded polar bears, which are a real problem. But it's as if we think that's the only problem. Once we sort out that polar bear situation, maybe artificial ice flows, I don't know, maybe that will help them. Maybe once we sort that out, it'll all be okay. Of course, simultaneously, Hollywood is telling us that in the future, it's all going to be terrible. It's going to be so bad. But that's kind of all in the future, right? We don't know exactly when that will be. And it might be because, as in the Matrix, the computers get really smart and decide to kill us all, or whatever they're doing in the Matrix. I never totally sorted that out. Or it's going to be like Mad Max, Fury Road, which frankly, let's face it, looks kind of cool. So there's this idea that, yes, things will be really, really bad, but also, Keanu Reeves will kick some ass, and then we're all going to get, things will be okay again. The trouble is, it's here. It's already happening. This is a quote from William Gibson, the science fiction author who came up with the term cyberspace in the novel Neuromancer. And he has this great line, the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. William Gibson was talking, I think, more about things like really high-tech, iPhones or whatever the latest thing is that hit many areas of the world before they hit others. But you could think of it in the same way about the effects of climate change. The future of climate change, the thing that we think is in the future, it's already here. It's just not everybody's seeing it in the same way. So who is seeing it? Well, the Arctic is seeing it because the Arctic is warming up twice as fast as the rest of the world. And that means that there are Alaskan villages that have to evacuate because the permafrost that they're built on is melting. And so the houses that have been there for, the villages that have been there for eons can't be there anymore. What else is changing? Well, if you live in the Philippines, you've had a series of extreme weather events, typhoons, hurricanes, over the last 10 years. This is Typhoon Haiyan, the worst of all of them, which killed 6,000 people. You don't have to go all the way to the Philippines to see this. I live in North Carolina. We got hit in the fall by Florence. North Carolina is not a stranger to hurricanes. Hurricanes hit North Carolina regularly, but Florence dumped more water on North Carolina than has ever been dumped on North Carolina before. And scientists suggest that up to 50% of the force of Hurricane Florence, the waterfall, the rainfall from Hurricane Florence, was due to warmer temperatures caused by climate change. These, the Weather Service, you may have seen this, the Weather Service is having to they're kind of running out of colors to show inches of rain. They just have like shades of black now. This is the area of North Carolina that got over 10 inches of rain about halfway through the hurricane. They were just massive amounts of water flooding out places that, again, had often been hit by hurricanes before, but never like this. I went to college in Houston, and I was actually there when Hurricane Alicia went through in 1983. I was a student at Rice University then. And so Houston also has gotten hit by extreme weather events very often over the years, but Harvey was like nothing else that had ever hit Houston before. Again, it wasn't so much the speed of the winds, it was the amount of the water. 200,000 homes were destroyed. 4 feet of water fell. Houston's basically flat. It's like a pool table. There's just nowhere for all that water to go. I was in Houston for a college reunion in November, and I met old friends who still hadn't been able to move back into their houses, or rather, hadn't been able to finish building their new houses. The new houses now have to be built on stilts, like at the beach. If you've been to the beach and you've seen beach houses up, that's now what Houston is requiring people to build their houses to do. Harvey's estimated to have caused something like $125 billion of damages. And again, scientists say you can see the footprint, you can see the fingerprint of climate change on Harvey. Maybe up to 20% of the water that fell on Harvey was a result of warmer temperatures in the Gulf of Mexico, which were contributing to the rainfall in Harvey. Other places around the world have had similar events. This is floods in Chennai, which killed thousands of people and displaced almost 2 million. Other places in the world see things drying up. This is Lake Poopó in Bolivia, which this is the second largest lake in the country. It's almost completely dry now. And again, the idea is scientists say this is the result of climate change. I was in Madagascar year before last in my work for the UN, and Madagascar was having the worst drought in decades, over a century in southern Madagascar. Countries like Madagascar have very few resources to deal with these kinds of problems. So when you're already poor, when you're already on the edge of starvation, having a drought that goes on for years pushes you over the edge. Climate change will also contribute by drying out land and causing less rain to fall in some places. It contributes to the destructive effect of wildfires. This is a slide I put in last year after the wildfires in California in 2017. And of course, the wildfires, as bad as they were last year, were dwarfed by the Paradise Fire and the Malibu Fire this last fall. The Paradise Fire is the most destructive fire in US history, caused over $16 billion worth of damage, killed about 100 people, and completely destroyed this town of Paradise in Northern California. From an international perspective, one thing that's, well, I should say maybe from a scientific perspective, one thing that's clear, if anything, is the inexorable increase in sea levels that's going to come as a result of climate change. Why is that? Do you know? Why is there, whatever else happens, and there's some argument about how much more intense hurricanes are going to get and so forth, but one thing scientists agree on just as a given is that water levels are going up. Why is that true?
Ice sheets melting in the Arctic.
So one big reason is there's a bunch of ice right now sitting on land. Right, if it's in the water and it melts, it's okay. I mean, it may cause other problems, but it's not going to raise over sea level rise. Just as when an ice cube melts in your drink, it doesn't cause the drink to overflow. But where is a lot of that ice in the Arctic region?
On the land.
Yeah, it's on Greenland, right? If all that ice in Greenland melts, that's a lot of ice. And of course, in Antarctica as well. So one problem is you have ice melting and running off into the ocean. What's the other big reason why water level is certain to rise? What happens to water when you heat it up? It expands, it gets bigger. So it's just, physics. So there's really not much we can do about that. So it is just a question of how quickly the sea level happens, but it's going to happen. And that means that there are millions and millions of people around the world that will be displaced from their homes. This is a picture of Bangladesh, just showing, this chart shows that sea level is expected to rise by, let's say 3 up to 4 feet. By 2100, that's about 1 meter. So here's a chart of Bangladesh showing what a 1 meter rise would do. Bangladesh is essentially a giant river delta. There's these huge rivers, the Ganges and others, that come out of the Himalayas up here and that flow into the Indian Ocean. That's all going to be underwater. But at least the Bangladeshi can go to higher land in principle. This is an island in the South Pacific called Kiribati. Kiribati, this is the island of Tarawa, the main island in the Kiribati chain. This is the highest point on South Tarawa. It's about 3 meters above sea level. I first got involved in this when I was doing pro bono work for the government of the Maldives, which is another coral atoll island chain country in the Indian Ocean. This is the capital of the Maldives, the island of Malé. There's about 100,000 people on that island. There's simply, you can tell, there's nowhere for them to go. When sea levels rise, it's going to make it impossible for them to continue to live here unless something happens. It's not just foreign countries, of course. This particularly hits home to my students in North Carolina because North Carolina loves its beaches. The Outer Banks are beautiful and spectacular. And of course, there are beautiful beaches all around the Gulf. A lot of them are going to be gone. They're just going to be gone. A meter rise here wipes out much of South Louisiana, the Outer Banks, and of course, if we're talking about where a lot of people live, Miami and southern Florida, it's just very hard to see those still being inhabitable places in another 50 or 100 years, the rate we're going. Miami in particular is essentially it's built on porous rock, at least as I understand it. So there's no real way of even making a seawall or something like that around Miami. The water just keeps seeping in underneath. So again, this has all been kind of, what does human rights add to this? Human rights gives you a language to describe what's going on. So when you're talking about what's happening to the Maldivian girls like the ones in this picture, you can talk about their rights to life, their rights to enjoy their own culture, their rights to their property, all of which are going to be gone as a result of climate change. I shouldn't say all of which, they're not going to necessarily die. It's not that the water's going to rise so quickly they can't get out in time. But the Maldives is probably going to have to look at the likelihood of evacuating its country. Some of the leaders of countries like the Maldives have started buying land in other countries or trying to work out deals. The South Pacific countries have started trying to negotiate deals with Australia and New Zealand to take their people as they leave. I mean, that's not great, putting it mildly. All right, so how do human rights norms apply to climate change? Scientists have pretty much said what we have to do to keep from these kinds of disastrous consequences, and that is to keep the increase in temperature below 2 degrees Celsius, well below 2 degrees Celsius. Again, we're already at 1 degree now. So that is a really tall order. In addition, states have obligations to help their people adapt to climate change. Even a 2-degree increase is already causing major problems. So states have obligations to adopt effective adaptation measures to protect against the harm. What does that mean? Well, the adaptation obligations can be fulfilled by every country doing whatever it can. So again, to go back to the Maldives, the Maldivian government has in fact built a seawall around its capital, and it's doing other things like trying to consolidate its population from the hundreds of islands they're now spread out onto a smaller number to make it easier to evacuate when necessary from extreme weather events. Part of the problem, of course, is, just so you're clear about this, it's not so much that you can live on the Maldives, until the water's up around your ankles or something like that. The problem is, as the water increases, it also makes things like storm surges worse. So the land becomes uninhabitable long before you're actually submerged. So seawalls can help with that. Of course, they're expensive, and the Maldives has to have help to do that. It's not a rich country. But the real problem is mitigation. The real problem that requires international cooperation is mitigation. Why is that? I know you've seen charts like this before, but this just breaks down who is doing all these emissions. What are the major sources of greenhouse gas emissions? You can kind of ignore the outer circle. Just focus on the middle circle here. About 1/4 of all greenhouse gas emissions are from China. The United States and the EU make up another 1/4. And the next 7 biggest emitters make up about another 1/4. So this is a problem that the 10 largest emitters are really primarily responsible for. About 75% of all emissions are from the 10 largest emitters. So for countries like the Maldives, there's really virtually nothing they can do to cut back on global emissions. Their percentage is just too tiny to have any effect. So that means it's necessary for them to get help. This is one of those charts that as a professor, you kind of like it so much, you just feel like you have to include it, and then you put it in, you're like, no one can understand this chart unless I spend 10 minutes on it. But let me just try and briefly explain why I think it's such a cool chart. This is from The Economist last year. Basically, the y-axis here is predicted monthly temperature variability. In other words, how much is climate change going to be affecting the temperature in this country, as far as we can predict? Some countries, more temperate countries, are going to see less variability than others. And then the x-axis is just how rich is the country. And what you see here is basically the countries up here, again, these are the countries that are going to be hit hardest by climate change, also turn out to be the poorest countries in the world for the most part. The richer countries in Western Europe, the United States, Ukraine, Russia, I mean, relatively rich compared to these other countries, are also going to be the countries that are going to be hit less hard. This is super unfair. This is a chart that shows, it's a few years old now, but nothing's really changed, and I like that it gives some examples of countries down here. Anyway, this is a country that shows the most vulnerable countries, and this is a map that shows the most vulnerable countries in the world. This is something that takes into account their vulnerability to climate change and also their level of resources to deal with it. And what you see is probably what you would expect. The most vulnerable countries include a lot of coastal countries, small island states, bigger island states like the Philippines and Indonesia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and the Sahel region. And again, these are areas where climate change is going to hit particularly hard. They also happen to be among the poorest countries in the world. So in this sense, climate change is inherently discriminatory. And again, human rights lets us talk about that in a way that otherwise we can't. Human rights law talks about how we have to cooperate to address threats to human rights. It's a fundamental principle of human rights law. So have states done that? Well, actually, yeah, they have. The states entered into the Paris Agreement in December 2015. I'm sure you've heard of that. It was quite a moment. I was there. People were very happy. The Paris Agreement includes some nice references to human rights in the preamble. Parties should, when taking action to address climate change, respect, promote, and consider their respective obligations on human rights. As always, when it's drafted by governments, it's not very well drafted because then they throw in a lot of other things that are kind of confusing. But the overall sense is good. A little bit more maybe to the point, the goal of the Paris Agreement includes the 1.5 degree target. This was the direct result of developing countries, the most vulnerable countries in particular, arguing we can't just have a 2 degree target because, among other things, that will harm our human rights. Countries actually cited human rights arguments, including a report that I worked on with some of my special rapporteur colleagues. Countries cited those reports as examples of the harm that climate change would cause to human rights as justification for the need to have a more aggressive target. Now, the question, of course, is it's nice to have that target, but how are you going to get to that target? Well, they're going to have to do adaptation planning, of course. There's going to be assistance from richer to poorer countries. The thing I want to talk about just briefly is this idea of nationally determined contributions. The Paris Agreement essentially leaves it up to each country to say what it's going to do. There's political reasons for that. We don't need to get into it right now. You can ask me afterwards if you want what I think about that. But it's kind of what was necessary to make the whole thing work. And countries have, in fact, submitted their commitments. And some of the commitments look pretty good. The United States committed to reduce its greenhouse gases by essentially 1/4 to 1/3 by 2025. The EU is more ambitious, 40% by 2030. Even China and India made fairly serious commitments. The problem is we have a long way to go to reach this 1.5 degree target. To reach a 1.5 degree target, that's the red pathway here. There's different estimates, but this one says we would pretty much have to zero out our greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Zero it out and then probably go negative, which means we're going to have to invent something we don't know how to do now to suck all that carbon out of the atmosphere. How close are we to doing this? Note that this means we're going to have to basically peak now and start going down very quickly. The UN did a report that added up all the countries' commitments and said, okay, so how close are we to that goal? And said, we're not really close to that goal at all. If you add it all up, we're looking at basically a 3 degree increase by 2100, not the 1.5 degree increase that countries said they were going to try and do. This gives you another chart, another way of looking at that. That means that where we were headed was up here, 4 or 5 degrees. Current policies put us at maybe a little bit under 4. If all the pledges countries make come through, we'll be under 3, which is good. But this is where we need to be below 2 or below 1.5. We're a long way to go. And that's assuming countries actually say they do what they're going to do. As you may have heard, there was an election in the United States a couple of years ago, and the president who got elected basically immediately went back on all the things the previous president, his name was Barack Obama, look him up, really interesting guy. All the things that the Obama administration said they were going to do in 2015, this president has said we're not going to do those things. What does this mean? Another way of looking at this is if China, the US, and the EU, the biggest emitters, all do exactly what they say they're going to do, this is where they'll be in 2030. And this is where the rest of the world is going to have to squeeze in all of their emissions. That's not very likely. So my report to the Human Rights Council after the Paris Agreement was basically, it's nice as far as it goes, but from a human rights perspective, they've got to go a lot farther. They have to strengthen their commitments in order to be able to meet the target set out in Article 2 of the Paris Agreement, the target they themselves said they have to meet. I should say, too, that along the way, human rights also sets standards for how you're meeting those targets. So in the past, for example, there have been some pretty massive human rights abuses committed in respect of some renewable energy projects, especially hydro projects. Dams, for whatever reason, always seem to cause massive human rights violations, or at least they seem prone to them. So this is an example. The Santa Rita Dam in Guatemala was essentially built in a way that pushed indigenous people off of their traditional home, flooded their villages without consulting with them, much less their consent. And when the indigenous people protested about this, many of them were detained, beaten up, and some were even shot. That's obviously not okay. You don't check your human rights obligations at the door just because you're doing something that you say will help the climate. And so that's another message I've tried to get across. So finally, this third thing that a human rights perspective can do, this one is briefer, I promise. Human rights can provide new paths for climate claims. So here's some examples of cases that have been brought in recent years around the world on a rights basis. They cite human rights, but they push for change in climate policy. This first one's interesting. The Philippine Human Rights Commission is a national human rights commission. It has no real binding authority, but it's holding a series of hearings basically to highlight that the carbon majors, the so-called biggest carbon emitting companies in the world, have really gotten scot-free. They've gotten off without having to pay any price for the fact that they have contributed so much to this problem. They're not going to be able to hold them legally accountable, but morally accountable. The hearings are doing maybe something along those lines. But for legal accountability, these cases are quite interesting. This is a case from 3 years ago in Pakistan that Mr. Asghar Laghari, a farmer, as far as I know, in Pakistan, this is not a picture of him, by the way, but rather of a flood in Peshawar. But in any event, he brought a case against the government of Pakistan saying, the government of Pakistan said that it's doing all these things to protect me from climate change, but when I look at what they're actually doing, they're not living up to their commitments. The interesting thing is he brought it based on the right to life in the Pakistani constitution, which the Supreme Court had earlier interpreted to include the right to a healthy environment. And the court said, okay, let's hear from the government. It pulled in all of these government officials from different agencies and said, okay, so what are you doing about climate change? To which the agencies all kind of pointed at each other and said, well, I think it's really their responsibility. And so the court said, okay, here's what I'm doing. All of you now, I am appointing to a new climate change commission. And you're going to give me regular reports on how you're meeting Pakistan's obligations, which is pretty cool. De Justicia, an organization in Colombia, brought a case on behalf of youths in Colombia against the government of Colombia, also on a human rights basis, and also got a favorable decision. Just last year, the Colombian court said, okay, they seem right to us, the government isn't doing enough, and specifically the government has to do more to protect the Colombian Amazon, which is a hugely important sink, a source of possible carbon reductions. Maybe the most famous decision yet is one brought by the Urgenda Foundation versus the Netherlands, which was decided first a couple of years ago, and then the appeal was just this last fall. It's also based on human rights. The Urgenda Foundation said that people's right to life is being violated because the Netherlands has not done enough, again, to meet its own targets for climate change, and they got a favorable decision. Just this last fall, the appellate court said, yeah, you know what, we agree with you. You've asked for a 25% reduction by 2020, and the Netherlands has said that's what they need to be doing, but they're not actually taking steps to get there. So we're going to order them to do what they have said they need to do, again, on a basis of protecting people's human rights. The case in the United States that's trying to follow this pattern is called Juliana versus the United States. Like the Colombian case, it's brought on behalf of a bunch of minors, children. I don't want to lie to you. I don't have super high hopes that this case is going to result in the same outcome, but it has served to raise attention, and who knows? I mean, it may turn out to be more positive than right now I'm thinking it's going to be, but it is an example of the kinds of cases that are getting traction increasingly in other places around the world. So that concludes my talk. I'm on Twitter. I only post about human rights and the environment, so if you're interested, you can follow me there. I promise no tweets about the Kardashians or whatever. My daughters are still a little horrified that I'm actually on social media at all, but they've accepted it, let's say, over time. As long as I stay off Instagram, I think they think I'm all right. But now I'm happy to answer any questions you might have, or if you have comments about any of this, any thoughts, I'm very happy to hear them. Yeah.
And I don't mean this to come off as like very skeptic, it's just like human rights definitely very important, and the environmental consequences caused by climate change is very obvious. But it's very ironic given that the human rights regime is led by countries such as Saudi Arabia, and they're on the International Human Rights Commission, and these countries obviously are not going to adhere to the changes necessary. So why is there such a focus to use this like regime of human rights to adhere to?
Like, what's the point of it all?
Well, obviously there's a point, but why
I don't know.
specifically
Maybe
through
there's
the
not.
human
Maybe
rights?
it's not obvious. Yeah.
Specifically through the human rights regime, why not other foundational aspects of international law?
Like what? Like what do you have in mind?
Like international economics laws that are more like strictly followed by countries because they want economic interest from other foreign development interests, FDIs.
Right.
Or,
Well, so I guess I would say, I totally take your point. And again, I would never want to suggest that the human rights mechanisms are super effective or powerful, or that this is the silver bullet. Now, we figured this out. And I spent a lot of time over the last 7 or 8 years now talking with human rights audiences, and especially at the beginning of my mandate, I would mainly talk to human rights audiences about environmental issues. Like, let me explain some environmental concepts to you. And I would talk to environmental audiences about human rights, because often I was trying to kind of build these bridges between them. And sometimes I would tell environmental audiences, audience of environmental advocates, I would say, this is great, you're also excited about human rights. I want to be clear that you're not going to suddenly solve all your problems just because it's going to get characterized as a human rights issue. In fact, if you want to make a human rights advocate laugh, suggest that that will solve all their problems, because human rights advocates know that it doesn't. So that does raise the question, well, what's the point at all? And I guess I would say the same thing about other human rights that I've been saying about environmental issues. It does help, it has a certain rhetorical punch, not in every country, but in many countries it does. It allows you to use a shared language to talk about issues that, at least in principle, even countries like Saudi Arabia have agreed to. So it's different from saying, look, you should do this because our culture says you should do this. It's not like that. Human rights law is more like, Esperanto or something. It's a language that maybe not everybody speaks as their first language, but it's a global language that everyone to some degree has accepted by joining the treaties that hold them to these standards. And then finally, there are some, as weak as they are, there are some human rights mechanisms that you can bring cases to. In terms of how powerful they are vis-a-vis economic mechanisms, I guess I would say one of the reasons economic mechanisms are more powerful is because they aren't based on human rights standards. Efforts to try and introduce human rights standards into the World Trade Organization, for example, get shot down for precisely that reason. They don't agree to that because they don't want those powerful economic sanctions that can hit you if you're violating a trade agreement. They don't want those to be available if you're violating a human rights agreement, right? So that's not to say it's not worth thinking about how to kind of incorporate them, but it's an uphill battle for the same reasons. Yeah.
Dovetailing to what you just said, and the Philippines case also reminded me of this. You may not be able to answer this question, but is there a special rapporteur or special commissioner looking at the effect of multinational corporate behavior on human rights in countries?
Yeah, so one of my predecessors as a special rapporteur is a fellow named John Ruggie, who's a professor at the Kennedy School at Harvard. And in 2005, I guess, he was appointed to be the first. His title was Special Representative of the Secretary General, because he was appointed directly by the Secretary General to address how human rights norms apply to corporations. Because it's always been this kind of gap, or to put it more positively, kind of a holy grail of human rights advocates to try and bring human rights to bear on corporations. Human rights treaties are essentially written as obligations on states. That was kind of their raison d'etre, and there's a lot of value in that. But that means that corporations, even though they may have a huge amount of power, have not been traditionally thought of as being directly subject to human rights norms. And so Ruggie did a lot of work over 6 years and came up with something called the Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which explain how human rights norms apply to corporations. Like mine, several years later, Ruggie, like me, had no ability to actually require anyone to do anything. We're just these independent experts, although Special Rapporteur is, again, the cooler name, but he did kind of pave the way, I think, to a clear understanding. What's going on now, which is interesting, is there's an actual negotiation to try and develop a treaty that would set out obligations on corporations under human rights law. The countries that are participating in that are all the developing countries. The countries that are not participating in it are all the developed countries. The United States in particular said we want no part of this. So, I mean, it's kind of like my answer to you. It's like, you know.
That wasn't exactly what I was asking.
Okay, sorry, go
I'm more
ahead.
concerned, or more interested, if someone is looking into the effect that corporate behavior has on the decision that developing second and third world countries make as far as whether they're looking at development dollars as being more important than enforcing their human rights obligations.
Well, there is now this, I mean, part of what came out of Ruggie's work is there is now a working group on business and human rights, which is composed of 5 experts who do just the kind of thing you're saying. In other words, they issue reports just on what corporations are doing in different countries. Whether it goes far enough to satisfy the concerns you're raising, that I think is a more open question. It's been criticized for not being aggressive enough, but at least there's something that exists. And of course, a lot of human rights organizations do publish pretty hard-hitting exposés of corruption that involves corporations and governments. Global Witness, for example, which is based in London, I would recommend as a particularly good, solid NGO that does really interesting, hard-hitting investigative work, kind of at that particular nexus. But yeah, that's a huge weakness, I would say, of the existing human rights regimes, that it focuses so much on governments and not enough on corporations.
What was the name of that group again?
Global Witness. Yeah.
So you talked about a duty to adapt,
Yeah.
and do you think that there is or should be, along with that, some sort of imposition of investment in research or development or something like that? Because as you've said, just eliminating is clearly not going to get us there. So you can adapt all you want, but if that duty doesn't give you some way to actually fix it, like what's it going to do anyway?
So this is a really interesting question. So in the climate regime, what we're talking about is called mitigation and adaptation. And mitigation is meant to include basically reducing emissions. And adaptation is adjusting your behavior to protect yourself from the inevitable or unavoided, maybe it's not inevitable, but the unavoided consequences of climate change. And at first, I would say, let's say 20 years ago, adaptation was almost kind of a bad word. Kind of for the reasons I think you're suggesting. It's like, shouldn't we really be focusing more on stopping the problem, fixing the problem, rather than kind of being told, let's just get used to all living with a warmer temperature? The problem is we didn't fix the problem 20 years ago. We just didn't. And so now even countries like the Maldives and Kiribati and Bangladesh that were the most vulnerable countries then as now, and then would say, we don't really want to talk about adaptation, like we need to reduce emissions. The trouble is they're feeling the effects now, and so they have to adapt. This is a lot of what I think, I didn't really spend much time talking about this, but this is a lot of where the international aid, the assistance needs to go from the developed world to the developing world, to make it, to do things like build seawalls, to do things like, you know, have adaptation plans at the country level. They're going to need a lot more money. And the commitment supposedly is going to be $100 billion a year from developed countries to developing countries, starting in 2020, which is now next year. Again, the Trump administration said, oh, we're not going to have any part of that. I mean, it's, you know, we're kind of running out of time to make the changes that we need to make, and we're still not really showing, in many parts of the world, we're not showing the commitment necessary to get those changes done. But to answer the question, no one really thinks adaptation is, I mean, it's the second best option. It's just that it's better than not doing adaptation and then having the consequences hit you regardless. Yeah.
So I have a few comments and I guess a question.
Sure.
It seems like the Paris Agreement was really weak. It didn't have any teeth to it. Like you couldn't bring any lawsuit or any action under it. So I guess maybe if there was some sort of imposition of international law, maybe it would be a better way to bring a lawsuit. Because the suit I'm thinking of is the Massachusetts versus EPA, which you could use, I guess, to bring a climate change or a lack of emission control, but you're going to run into problems with standing. You run into your public trust doctrine issues in the AmeriPower versus
Sorry,
Connecticut.
when you are referring to Massachusetts EPA, do you mean a suit against the United States in domestic court in the U.S., or are you talking about like at the international level?
If you could make it a suit against the United States in some way as opposed to just a statewide suit, I think that would have a lot more effect than just having it at a state level like Massachusetts, which I'm not sure what their output is. But also,
Well, that is, just to be clear, that is what the Juliana suit is trying to do. I mean, it's against
Right.
the entire United States. Again, I don't think it's very likely to win, but it is an effort to do what you're saying.
isn't that because it's too generalized of a grievance to have standing?
Well, they're not basing their suit on the agreement, they're basing their suit on the Constitution. It's a very innovative constitutional argument, and it kind of assumes that the people on the court are more like, I don't know, William Brennan and William O. Douglas instead of, the people that are actually on the court.
Right.
But I do understand what you're saying. I guess what I would say in defense of the Paris Agreement is there simply is no supranational enforcement body in the world. There just isn't.
So then why not do it at a national level instead of at the international level where countries clearly aren't listening or are pulling out?
Well, I wouldn't say that all countries are pulling out or listening. I mean, let me put it this way. So you talked about the trade agreement as being a particularly kind of powerful agreement. The trade agreement essentially, many aspects of the trade agreement look like the Paris Agreement. In other words, nothing in the trade agreements says you have to zero out I'm talking about the overarching trade agreements, not like free trade areas like NAFTA or the EU agreements. But overarching global free trade agreements don't say everybody has to lower their tariffs to zero. They say, let's all negotiate downward, but if you want to keep some tariffs high in some areas and low in other areas, in general, we're going to let that go. Of course, they've been working on the trade agreements now for decades, and so over time, the tariffs have gotten lower and lower and lower. But there's still a huge amount of discretion for each country to say, we need to protect this particular industry, so we're going to protect this industry. The Paris Agreement in some ways looks like that. In other words, the Paris Agreement says, each country knows best how to reach our targets. So it just isn't going to work to have overarching standards that this non-existent supranational body would impose on us. The question is, are they actually going to try and meet the targets? Are they really going to commit to do it? And for that, the reason I'm kind of cautiously optimistic about that is precisely because we've waited so long that now the adverse consequences are becoming clear.
Yeah.
So I was in China 3 years ago now at a conference on climate change and human rights. And the people there who were, let's say, most in tune with the government position were also very fervent that the Chinese government was actually going to do more than meet its targets. And you know what? I tend to believe them. I think China has kind of gotten religion, if that's not the right metaphor, but
I see where the metaphor is.
but China now thinks it has to fix its environmental problems because you literally can't go outside in Beijing without wearing a mask or, greater risk. I think China thinks we just have to kill two birds with one stone here. Maybe that's a better analogy. It's not going to do us no good to spend billions of dollars cleaning up sulfur dioxide and carbon monoxide if then we're still going to have all the carbon dioxide problems too. We should just invest heavily in renewable energy and get there. I think it'll do it fast enough? I don't know. But I think at least the Paris Agreement sets up a framework through which countries will report on what they're doing. They can put pressure on each other. They can put pressure on laggards. And if Obama was still in office, again, this Obama guy was aces, I think the United States would be among the countries putting that pressure on them. But he's not, and that is a big part of the problem.
You don't think an international body that has the ability to bring the Chinese government in would work better?
What would that government look like?
I have no idea.
Yeah, there just isn't anything. I mean, this is the frustrating thing about international law. There simply is no intergalactic Star Trek Federation that you can use. I mean, I'm not trying to make fun of your position at all. It's a continual frustration for students of international law.
Well, granted, we do have like the CISG and other things that kind of work. I think if the Paris Agreement had more teeth, or somehow had a little more oomph to it, where you could bring in or impose some sort of liability, I would have liked that a lot more.
Yeah, but again, you just have to realize, it still comes down to the same thing.
Yeah.
It comes down to government consent. It's not, there's no way to go around that.
Yeah.
It's like saying if we had more government consent, we'd have more government consent.
Right.
Yeah, I'm sorry, David, did you have a?
I was just going to reinforce something that you brought up, and that is, I don't think students necessarily understand in the international discussions how important peer pressure actually is. And that when one country start nudging other countries at the ambassador and presidential level, it really can't have consequences. So you can get progress, not as much as we'd like, without the stick. The question is, can you nudge them forward with discussion? And maybe, yeah, we need a president that has a different view of the world. But a court isn't going to solve our problems.
Let me put it a different way. Remember that chart where I showed there like 3 emitters, basically are 50%, us, the EU, and China. It is really hard to move those big boulders. They are really big boulders. Once they start rolling though, they're going to carry all the other rocks with them. Once China gets to a certain point, once the EU and the US all get to a certain point, they're going to be really pissed off at countries that are not going along with them. We've seen that happen in other areas. Ozone depletion is a good example. I just taught this again to my international environmental law students the other day, and ozone depletion is this huge success story. And there's various reasons for that, but basically that hole in the ozone layer is healing. And a big part of that is because the biggest, most powerful economic powers in the world decided they wanted to make it happen, and then they put a lot of pressure on other countries to go along with them. So in some ways you can narrow it down more. It's not the consent of all the governments that's so important, it's the consent of the biggest governments, or the most powerful. Did you have?
Yeah, I just had 2 follow-up questions with regards to the, I think it's the Ozone Convention.
I'm sorry, the which?
The convention, the Ozone Convention that
The Montreal Protocol.
Yeah, so with that, it basically made it harder for countries to trade with other countries that produce it. So on the same level, can't a future protocol do the same or impose the same limitations?
There are a lot of tools powerful countries can use to induce less powerful countries to change their behavior. It's just a question of political will to use them. But yeah, you're right. The Montreal Protocol used a combination of carrots and sticks, which include money. And the nice thing about carrots and sticks are often a carrot can become a stick. In other words, once you start giving a country, a lesser developed country, money to change its behavior in a certain way, then you kind of have them. So if they stop doing what you want them to, you just threaten them with cutting off the money. That's a lot of what the Montreal Protocol did. It set up a fund, the multilateral fund, through which literally billions of dollars flowed to allow countries to essentially substitute ozone depleting chemicals with non-ozone depleting chemicals. And so if you were part of the Montreal Protocol and you complied, then you were eligible for all this money. If you weren't, then you weren't eligible for it, and no other countries would trade with you in these ozone depleting substances and things containing them, like air conditioning units and fire extinguishers and things like that. The trouble is just carbon is such a bigger problem. I mean, so the same tools could be used, it's just the political will to get there. It's a lot harder to motivate. Other questions? Yeah.
I guess kind of going off of that, I'm curious what your opinion is on, since enforcement is more difficult and we know that, like, from the graph that you showed, that it is, like, even if we were to be, like, perfect and going down from this point on, for people going into the field and people entering now, what do you think is the most effective use of our time to sort of help this move along better?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, one, I guess, nice thing about having this be such a gigantic problem is that there's lots of places you can kind of try and push on it that would make a difference. And so a lot of it really depends on what you're interested in. You know, if you're interested in, and if your passion is like renewable energy, great. There's a lot of stuff that can be done to try and make it easier for renewable energy to happen. So to give you an example for that, my brother works for the Navy on renewable energy and smart grids and things like that. And because my brother, unlike myself, is this kind of person, he decided to make his house net zero. Actually, his whole life net zero, but he started with the house. And so he did things like sink geothermal wells and put solar panels all over his roof. This is in Washington, D.C., and all this really cool stuff, and pretty much got there. he said a lot of what he spent a lot of time doing were the technical aspects of the problem. And of course it was expensive, it's not like something everybody can do. And he knew a lot about what needed to be done, so he had that expertise. So a lot of it was simply dealing with the regulatory structure. You know, it is really, really hard to get the necessary permits to do that. We do not make it easy for people to essentially get off the grid. So that's one example. I mean, that seems like a small thing, but I guess, you know, everything counts. Like everything people can work on counts. So, so it's not all about bringing in suits like Juliana. That may be a great thing to do, or it may not. There may be other things to work on. There's a lot of really interesting things going on at the state level now. States in the United States are doing a lot of cool stuff. My oldest daughter, to give another family example, just graduated from college last year. She's working for an organization in Boston called the Massachusetts Climate Action Network. She has become an expert on building codes. The Massachusetts Climate Action Network is pushing, you said a lot of things can happen in Massachusetts that can't happen elsewhere, and this is certainly an example. They're pushing to have basically really strong green building codes in Massachusetts, but that requires, because of the way Massachusetts law works, that requires essentially getting all of these local governments and entities to support those kinds of changes. And so Rebecca is working with this organization that is educating local governments, working with local governments, holding conferences to kind of push for these changes in the codes. But that's a pretty, I mean, in one sense, it's a tiny little change. In another sense, it's really important, and if enough things like that happen, it adds up. What kind of cracks me up when I describe this is my daughter, Rebecca, her major in college, this should be in some, I think a lot of law students look at environmental issues and are like, well, I didn't major in the right things to really be able to do this kind of stuff. Let me tell you, my daughter, Rebecca, majored in English and Italian. She did not take a single environmental course of any description whatsoever the entire time she was in college. She got this internship kind of, she found out about it and thought it sounded interesting, and then she literally called me up the night before the interview and said, okay, Dad, I need to tell you everything you know about climate change. And I literally emailed her some of my slides on climate change, and I was like, okay, where should we begin? Let's start at the beginning. And now she's telling me stuff I had no idea how. I mean, Massachusetts building codes, I knew nothing about that. So anyway, there's a lot going on in this area. It's very different from what it was even 10 or 15 years ago. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of different handles to try and push on. Just don't get discouraged if you feel like your handle is not that big. None of the handles are that big. But the fact is, what matters is that there's so many people each pushing. Anything else? That was good. Gave me a chance to finish with a little more positive. I'm actually fairly positive about all this, more than maybe has come across. Maybe because I've been teaching this now for 20 years. And for so much of it, there's just nothing really happening. At least now, there are things happening. China, I think, I'm cautiously optimistic about. Something we haven't talked about is technology is now much, much farther advanced than it was. All my life I've been hearing about solar panels, how they're the next big thing, but now finally solar panels have gotten cheaper. Wind power is actually growing pretty rapidly. So it's the technical problems are more solvable than we often think. The problems now are politics. The political problems are the real stumbling blocks now. But I'm pretty optimistic we could solve climate change as a problem if we decided politically that we had to do it.
On that note,
Okay.
thank you so much.